So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And like Rucker, I like to pace around, and I hope it's not distracting. You know, one of the challenges I think academics like me face when we try to engage in sort of an important translational component, taking our research and putting it on a footing where it can be really useful for a broader public and understanding policy implications, is, you know, we tend to embrace sort of nuance and ambiguity, and it just sort of vexes efforts to kind of push the discussion forward. So I wanted to foreground sort of an answer, a definitive, clear answer to the question that's kind of motivating our session. Can federal education policy reduce educational inequality? Unfortunately, my preferred answer is going to be sometimes. There is going to be some nuance in it, but I think this nuance is going to be really salient for thinking about the way forward, particularly under the Every Student Succeeds Act. So in particular, in many ways, I'm picking up where Rucker left off, and what we've done with that miracle of policymaking from the Great Society era, and how ESSA has been adapted, beginning with No Child Left Behind in 2002. So I'm going to talk briefly about what we know about that, and I'm going to talk about some of the work I and others have done on stimulus-funded school turnarounds, and then the school reforms that have been ongoing under NCLB waivers, and then finally conclude with kind of projecting that forward for where are we with the Every Student Succeeds Act. And in particular, ESSA, I think we've all agreed to call it ESSA, combines elements of all three of these. So I think this evidence is really going to be salient as we look forward to this. And I want to stress from the outset, too, that all of these reforms focus on trying to improve the performance of schools, particularly those serving historically marginalized students. But that shouldn't be taken to kind of tacitly deprecate the role of out-of-school factors, you know, the so-called opportunity gaps, in explaining the broader patterns of inequality that Sean discussed. And it's my sense that sometimes the public discourse around this presents us with a false choice, that we can either fix poverty or fix schools, rather than thinking about ways to do both. And I think, and I just, again, think that's a false choice. And that might be something we turn back to as during the discussion period. Okay, so many people here know what NCLB is, but just a quick reminder, it introduced annual testing nationwide of all students in grades 3 through 8 in math and reading, and at least once in high school. States had the autonomy to develop their own tests and proficiency standards, so we saw a lot of variance in those. There was public reporting of performance at the school level, including results for individual subgroups, and I think this is vitally important. And it was kind of the basis for what Sean was able to show us about the gaps that exist among subgroups within the same districts and schools, and that Rucker also mentioned. As you know, schools were required to make adequate yearly progress, and we had this moonshot rhetoric of having all students proficient by 2014, which hasn't happened. Children are still being left behind. And embedded in this was also a pattern of escalating supports and sanctions, so-called corrective actions, for schools that failed to make AYP. Okay, so what do we know about the effects of No Child Left Behind on student achievement? Well, yeah, it's important to note that NCLB brought test-based school accountability to scale across the US simultaneously, which really creates kind of a vexing evaluation problem. But there was this recent report that I'll leverage from the National Research Council on test-based accountability that provided this kind of panel-based synthesis of the evidence on NCLB, but also some other reforms as well, like exit exams. So they made a point of having like very clear study filters. They excluded studies that didn't really have a comparison group, including the Department of Ed's own study of No Child Left Behind, which really just sort of looked at trend data. They also excluded cross-sectional studies that didn't really think about selection into accountability policies. And interestingly, they also excluded regression discontinuity studies, some very clever studies with a strong causal warrant that leveraged the proximity of schools to thresholds for AYP sanctions. Because they, as many of my students know, I'm a big fan of regression discontinuity designs, and I'll be talking about the results from several of them shortly. The concern about them in this context is if you're comparing schools local to a threshold that implies sanctions or not, all of those schools are living under the effects of the policy. So you're not necessarily capturing the whole effect of the policy. So instead, they say our preferred estimates for these programs is positive effect of 0.08 standard deviations, and they leveraged the studies from the pre-NCLB period described by Lee et al. And the work that Brian Jacob and I did on No Child Left Behind, which I'll describe briefly now. Okay, so again, we've got this problem. How can we credibly identify the effects of a policy that essentially was implemented nationally, everywhere, at the same moment in time? Well, what Brian and I pointed out was that, look, many states had consequential school accountability policies prior to No Child Left Behind. If I'm recollecting correctly, it was slightly more than half of states. And in fact, many of them sued when No Child Left Behind came on the scene, basically arguing, look, we're already doing this. Don't make us undertake the effort of reconstituting our accountability systems just to meet the federal guidance. But in a whole bunch of other states, NCLB catalyzed a de novo experience with consequential school accountability. So this forms the basis for sort of what we can think of as kind of a diff and diff study I'll describe. And I should also note that Wong, Cook, and Steiner independently came up with a very similar sort of research paper that also has some other design features in it, looking at the stringency of the proficiency standards, but using it with ex post data on what states did in defining their standards, and also public-private school comparisons. As a quick aside about a sort of a cautionary tale in research, in our early work on this, Brian Jacob and I also included public Catholic school NAEP comparisons to examine the effects of NCLB. But then we wanted to check, are Catholic schools really keeping their traits similar as NCLB came online? And what we observed was that in the fall of 2002, ostensibly the first implementation year of No Child Left Behind, Catholic school enrollment dropped discreetly and then started a new trend going downward. And at first I was a little vexed by this, and then someone pointed out to me that that was the beginning of the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. And it was literally the Boston Globe report that was the basis of the Spotlight movie was within days of George W. Bush signing the NCLB legislation. So you get similar results when you use that public Catholic school comparison, but we didn't quite have confidence in it as a quasi-experimental contrast. Okay, so in our study, we use achievement data at the state year subject grade level from the main NAEP. And it's important to use the NAEP in this context because the NAEP is a low-stakes test. It has no consequences for schools. You'll see often dramatic gains on a state's own high-stakes assessment, but we don't necessarily think of that as measuring really valid gains in school performance because teachers might just be adjusting their practice to the idiosyncrasies of that high-stakes test. So pretty much everyone in the literature agrees that we should focus on the NAEP instead. Now, it had somewhat limited coverage prior to No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind compelled every state to participate in NAEP, but prior to that, depending on the test, only 37 to 39 did. Though we find the external validity looks good. The states that are included sort of resemble the nation. So we've got what should be a kind of difference in difference design. Let's compare the achievement changes in states that had new experiences with school accountability relative to the contemporaneous changes in states that had already had it. Now, the problem with that, though, is that there are differential pre-trends. You know, the states that were introducing school accountability prior to No Child Left Behind were seeing growth in their school performance. And there's a literature that kind of bears that out. So we generalize the diff and diff design using a technique better known in the program evaluation literature than I think in many academic literatures, called a comparative interrupted time series design. And it essentially creates kind of parametric controls for the differential pre-trends. So the way you want to think of this graph here is that the sort of black triangles, the black line, represents what you can think of as treatment states. States that did not have school accountability prior to No Child Left Behind. And these are states that were introducing test-based school accountability during the 1990s. And so you can sort of see the result from the prior literature here that these states started out below those states, but as they introduced school accountability, their achievement grew and even somewhat exceeded that of the other states. Okay, so then how do we think about identifying the effect of NCLB here? Well, the starting point is to say, well, as we go to the first year, we see this jump in states as they introduce school accountability. That could partly be the effect of NCLB. That could be the effect of 1,000 other things that are changing over this period. How do we form a counterfactual for how they deviated from their pre-trend? Well, we can examine how did these schools that had already had school accountability differentiate from what would have been predicted by their pre-trend over this period. And the difference in those two stylized differences allows us to isolate the effect of having a brand new experience with school accountability under No Child Left Behind. So what do we find? We find quite large gains in 4th grade math, some evidence of gains in grade 8 math, but they're not always statistically significant, small effects on grade 4 reading in the NAEP, and also essentially 0 effects on grade 8 math. Now with the grade 8 math, the pre-data didn't really fit the model very well, so we didn't have a lot of confidence in it. We reported in the appendix, but what the NRC panel did is they took these numbers and the 0 in the appendix, averaged them. That's how they got the 0.08. But one of the problems with that is it's kind of masking this heterogeneity, and it's also masking heterogeneity by subgroup. So when we look at the white students in the NAEP, we see smaller gains in math, somewhat larger gains in grade 4 reading. For the black students in NAEP, much larger gains in grade 4 math, and bigger gains, though not statistically precise all the time, in grade 8 math. And similarly, much bigger effects for Hispanic students over this period. So summing up, I mean, the effects on achievement appear meaningful, and using common metrics, I mean, these correspond to roughly a whole year of learning in math. But they're targeted in several ways that I think the debate hasn't acknowledged. They're not nationwide effects because many other states had already adopted NCLB-like policies. They're concentrated in a subset of states, they're concentrated by grade and subject, and they're larger for subgroups. And so, you know, and they're clearly not transformational. I mean, I want to be clear. Children are still being left behind, but these gains are sort of non-trivial, and they had contributed to declines in achievement gaps in that subset of states. Now, we also have some follow-up work that tries to look at what's been going on with mediators, because there's a lot of discussion about the distortionary effects of having test-based accountability, but a good deal of that evidence is based on survey questions, which is like, you know, how has NCLB changed your instructional practice? And there's kind of a reference bias in framing questions that way. So what we did in this study was we took school finance data and also data from the schools and staffing survey, where teachers just independently report how much instructional time do you have? How do you allocate that instructional time? How are you perceiving dimensions of student engagement? And basically what we find is in states that introduced NCLB, their spending went up by $600 per pupil, and was largely from state and local sources, which is consistent with the kind of unfunded mandate view for these schools that had to kind of get from a dead stop to a working school accountability system. We also see evidence of higher teacher salaries in states that introduced this, but no class size reductions, and no change in overall instructional time, but a reallocation away from non-tested to tested subjects. Teachers reported that they were spending less time on science and social studies and more on math and reading, though the effect sizes were fairly modest. They're equivalent to around 45 minutes of instruction a week. Okay, so let me segue to another kind of controversial prominent policy. In 2009, Arnie Duncan called for a nationwide focus on turning around chronically underperforming public schools. We want transformation, not tinkering, he said. And he had the money to kind of back this up in a pretty interesting way. You know, the overall stimulus funding gave the Department of Education around $98 billion. Well over $50 billion of that was pushed out through the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund just to keep districts from firing teachers. But they took smaller portions and tried to kind of seed innovation and experimentation in states through things like Race to the Top, you know, Teacher Incentive Fund, and this redesigned school improvement grant. They got $3 billion. Okay, so along with this, you know, the school improvement grant program had been pre-existing but kind of inert and underfunded. They established new guidance for this that targeted eligibility for a school improvement grant to PLA schools, persistently lowest achieving. And they increased the amounts of the award so that a school that got a school improvement grant could receive $2 million, an individual school, for each of 3 years. So $6 million over 3 years. But in many ways, they had to sing for their supper. If they accepted the grant, they had to implement a federally prescribed turnaround model. And there were basically 4 approaches. And I'll describe each of them, but they're transformation, turnaround, restart, or they could just close the school. They were all typically given about $50,000 for the very few schools that closed under this program. So I'm going to show you some results on the effects of this reform in California, which of around 800 SIG awards had close to 100, so a huge fraction of the ones that were awarded nationally. But let me talk about what they were supposed to do under this federal model. The transformational model involved a focus on teacher and principal effectiveness. One of the first things they needed to do was get a new school leader. Replace the principal unless there's kind of a safe harbor provision if the principal had been there a year or two. Introduce staff evaluations and professional development. Comprehensive instructional reform, focusing on the use of data and differentiated instruction. Extending learning time. Operational flexibility and technical assistance from various sources, but also socio-emotional and community services, health, nutrition, social services. So in many ways, this model is a kind of convex combination of no excuses and broader, bolder initiatives in the way it kind of mixes these together. What about the other federal models? Under turnaround, they had to do everything they were supposed to do in the transformation model and replace 50% of the teachers in that school. Okay. And under the restart model, they had to reopen under the management of a charter school operator, a CMO, and EMO. What does the distribution of the choices here look like among SIG recipients? Transformation was commonly characterized as the least disruptive, and it was the most widely chosen. Roughly 3 out of 4 SIG recipients chose transformation, around 20% chose turnaround, and nationwide only 4% chose restart, and only 16 schools nationwide chose closure. I think there was just one in California, it was Willie Brown Elementary. Okay, what's the tacit sort of theory of change here? Well, it's that chronically underperforming schools serving students in concentrated poverty have way more than one problem, right? There are multiple sort of self-reinforcing problems around weak leadership, ineffective instructional practices, poor working conditions that contribute to high turnover and a churn of novice teachers who are often the least effective point in their careers when they're serving the students who most need genuine teacher quality. Okay, and so the theory here is that genuinely effective change has to be quick, dramatic, and extensive rather than marginal and targeted. And the language around the SIGs in particular emphasizes giving schools operational authority, giving them supports, and giving them monitoring. Okay, but we also have legitimate concerns about unintended consequences here. Our colleague Linda Darling-Hammond and Rick Hess at AEI actually co-wrote an op-ed, which was kind of interesting, where they argue that it was kind of the first intimation of the political bedfellows we've seen under ESSA, between sort of Tea Party Republicans, I think, and teacher unions, where they argued that this was counterproductive micromanagement. It was likely to have weak buy-in, low-quality implementation, and to be actively disruptive in these schools. But these concerns might possibly be attenuated in some settings by the fact that it's hard for a school principal to slow roll an implementation if they've been replaced, right? And there are efforts in some states, and we're going to say it's a very uneven effort, to monitor. Okay, so let me quickly walk through what went on in California. There are around 3,600 schools that were in the so-called Tier 1 and Tier 2 pools in California for eligibility for a SIG. Title I schools in improvement, corrective action, or restructuring, and Title I eligible secondary schools. The lowest 5% of them, 183, based on a baseline achievement measure, are identified as persistently lowest achieving, and they're eligible to apply for the grant. Many districts applied for their schools, and 92 Cohort 1 SIG awards were made. Now, the key assignment rule for this eligibility was this baseline math ELA proficiency rate, and they had separate thresholds for each school level, where if you were below that, you were eligible to receive this grant. So here's what we see in terms of the treatment take-up. As you move towards schools that are at this arbitrary baseline achievement threshold, you see this discrete jump to around 25 percentage points in the likelihood of taking up the treatment. And so this is the basis for a regression discontinuity design that can give us credibly causal evidence on the effects of this school turnaround activity. By looking at outcomes around this arbitrary threshold and seeing as treatment status shifts discretely there, do outcomes shift there as well? So, and I want to point out that these persistently lowest achieving schools are serving 74% Hispanic students, 13% Black, 85% free or reduced price lunch eligible, 42% English language learners. Now, for our main but not our only outcome, we're using the Gone But Not Forgotten Academic Performance Index in California. So this is a weighted school-level performance index based on multiple statewide tests, and for many years was the cornerstone of the state's accountability system. So quickly, what do we see in terms of results? We want to ask, does this sort of school performance measure change discretely at that arbitrary threshold that defines eligibility for taking up the money? And so this is what we see after the first year of the turnaround schools. There's a pretty big jump here. I've narrowed in on the threshold. This is for the second year. And we've also replicated this just using the underlying CST scores and by subject. We're in the process of sort of looking at the third year of results now. So to sum this up, there were year one gains, and they appeared to be concentrated only in the subset of California schools that chose the turnaround model. But by year two, we see gains in both the transformation and turnaround schools. The gains are about a 34-point API increase. That's 5% of the mean among SIG-eligible schools. Or another way to frame this is about 23% of the gap between the lowest achieving schools and the state accountability goal. So another way to frame this is, in terms of a school level standard deviation, it's nearly a third of an increase, but that implies at the student level, which is how we commonly think of standard deviation measures, it's about 0.09. Now, the other thing you need to remember about this as you're thinking about effect size is it's a costly intervention, right? In California, these schools got on average $1,500 per pupil. So if we compared that to another costly but effective intervention, the class size reductions in Project STAR, where we saw 0.2 standard deviation gain for an increase of around $5,000, it's maybe moderately more cost effective. But make no mistake, these gains came at a non-trivial sort of financial cost. Okay, in terms of what went on in these schools, there's a broad federal effort to collect data nationwide. And that information is still coming out from these sort of surveys. There actually appear to be few differences in operational authority and school supports among low-performing schools that are SIG or non-SIG. But you do see the SIG schools reporting they're more likely to replace the principal, they're increasing learning time, and lots of other things that they were supposed to be doing. But there's also concerns about implementation quality. So I'm lifting a screenshot here from one of my favorite reads, which is Education Week, discussing a GAO report that criticizes the Ed Department on the School Improvement Grant Program. The states report they're having staff and recruitment and retention challenges in these schools, and in 23 of the 44 states where these awards were made, it appears the grants were renewed even when the schools weren't meeting their annual goals. So the teeth in the monitoring seem kind of weak. And then there's a lot of discussion about the sustainability, particularly of the effort to extend learning time once the money's gone, right? And that's sort of relevant for what we're thinking about going forward, because the financial side of the way this is instantiated in our forthcoming policies is different. Okay, so then let me move on again to the third part, which is this is emerging research with a team of graduate students here around the related school reforms that have been ongoing under NCLB waivers. And this is work that's been funded by the Spencer Foundation and WT Grants and the Walton Foundation. The background here is there were years of frustrating congressional inaction on reauthorizing NCLB. Right? Everyone knew it was a 1.0 kind of system. There seemed to be broad agreement about ways in which it needed to be changed. But I think it was a victim of sort of the broader political churn and other issues, and just that inaction was never taken up, and that effectively ceded authority to the executive branch. So in 2001, the Obama administration took that up, and they began offering waivers to states that essentially implemented their vision of what NCLB reauthorization should look like. And that included college and career-ready standards, the flexibility to define achievement goals, not just based on levels, but on growth. But it also said you need to have concentrated school improvement efforts in the 15% of most troubled schools. That included priority schools. Again, the lowest achieving 5% were encouraged to adopt these turnaround principles, like the SIG program, but it was essentially SIGs without the G, without the money. Right? They were told to do this, taking your extant Title I funding and sort of make this work. Now, the other thing they did that was kind of interesting, and they said, you have to identify at least 10% of your schools that have the largest achievement gaps or the lowest performance among those kind of relevant subgroups, and bring kind of some type of flexible intervention there to try to close achievement gaps. Okay, and this is really the focal point of where our current work is. Partly because it's a novel intervention, but it really is the kind of signature federal initiative right now to close achievement gaps. And because it uses this 10% threshold, right, it gives us an opportunity to do causal inference about the effects of this signature reform with regression discontinuity design. So we've got 3 papers that'll be coming out soon. One focuses on Kentucky, is with Charday Bonilla. And Kentucky identified focus schools by taking all the subgroups together and saying this is kind of the super subgroup, and we're going to use the performance of that aggregate subgroup to identify which schools should get this focus designation or not. North Carolina did this slightly differently, and this is work with Chris Doss. They identified focus schools by saying identify the highest performing and lowest performing subgroup in your school, an explicit subgroup. In almost all cases, whites were the highest performing group, students with learning disabilities were the lowest performing group, and identified them using them that way. Now, in a work with Elise Dizon-Ross, we're also focusing on Louisiana. Now, they had a reconstituted school accountability program that corresponded with the focus school rollout, where they were giving schools letter grades, A through F, based on a school performance index. And their priority schools were just, they said, it's going to be the schools in the recovery school district, which are just out of our analysis. But they had a system that essentially combined focus school reforms with an accountability reform that seems to have been effective in other states. Some states like Florida that had these kind of A through F systems, even if they're just gaming to get away from it by focusing narrowly on that test, schools tried to get out of those letter designations. And so Louisiana has a situation where they appear to be combining them. So, you know, all 3 of these studies use RD designs as I described, and as I walk through the results, I think it's going to suggest some of the complexity of federal policy in a highly federalist system, because basically there's a ton of heterogeneity across these results. Now, partly because I'm a fan of Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns, in one of my favorite movies is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I think of these in that frame. This is the good, this is the bad, and I'm going to show you this is the ugly, in terms of the results, in terms of the quality of the implementation. So first, what went on in Kentucky? Kentucky's focus school implementation emphasized the flexibility to use Title I funds school-wide rather than through sort of targeted assistance. Big emphasis on teacher teams, professional learning communities to help teachers collaborate and use data. Extended learning time, explicitly trying to extend learning time using computer-aided instruction, and this is a picture from a Kentucky newspaper showing some kids engaging in that. Technical assistance around planning and implementation, requiring them to articulate comprehensive school improvement plans, and state monitoring. So what do we see at that arbitrary threshold that separates the 10% of schools that are doing this from the other schools that are not? Well, here's math proficiency around this threshold. And we see as you cross it, as you go from non-focus school to focus school status, we see a 7.5 percentage point increase in math proficiency. And notice the mean here just to the right of the threshold on the control side is around 30%. So that's a non-trivial improvement. And it's not just at the proficiency threshold. You might worry, are they focusing on bubble kids near that? We see this gains at other thresholds of their test metric. And this is I think their K-Prep test, which is sort of Common Core aligned. So this is for reading proficiency, we're seeing 4.5 percentage point increase, which is around 12% relative to the level here. And we're also, through some of the data Kentucky collects, able to get some information on mediators, teacher surveys. And teachers on schools on this side of the threshold relative to that side report that they're getting higher quality professional development and instructional supports for their classroom practice. Okay, what about North Carolina? Well, North Carolina articulated some of the same things. You're going to do school needs assessments, revise improvement plans, have professional learning communities and teacher professional development, extended learning time, and interestingly, reforms to school discipline policies, which I think is a huge part of the sort of school to prison pipeline Rucker was discussing. But interestingly, you know, we did, it's hard to get at the kind of mediating variables, but my co-author Chris went and looked at many of the school improvement plans, and you could see, not all of them, but many of them articulated the specific subgroup for which they had been designated a focus school. So what do we see when we look at outcomes? Well, we do see a pretty big jump, and the focus schools are on the right here because this is a gap score measure. The right are the ones with the biggest gaps. So these are the focus schools. And we see a jump there of around 3.7 percentage points, which is pretty big relative to these schools, though the gains seem to have faded in the most recent year of the data. And more disturbingly, when we look at this for Hispanic students, we actually see statistically significant reductions to the right of this threshold, right? And so part of the concern here is, remember, most schools were identified for white learning disability gaps. The black students are overrepresented in that learning disability group, and Hispanics are not. Right? So it may have been that schools, because their whole mindset had been oriented around singular subgroups rather than the kind of super gap group, that there was triage behavior. And we're trying to figure out if we can get better information to kind of understand what was actually going on inside the proverbial black box. Okay, so that was the good, the bad, now the ugly. In Louisiana, you know, they talked about we're going to do data review and needs assessment, technical assistance, focusing on Common Core implementation, though even at the state level, many people are trying to get rid of the Common Core, teacher evaluation systems and school choice, plus the accountability pressure from this F label. But there are monitoring reports from the federal government we've been reviewing that were really critical of what went on in Louisiana, arguing that, you know, the implementation is simply not meeting expectations. And we see that in the data. This is a baseline school performance that separates F schools from D schools, and we see there's really no statistically significant jump there, either in the first full year or second full year, and no effects on subject-specific schools or by school level. Sometimes researchers, we worry about when you do a lot of statistical tests, you'll find something significant just by chance. We can't even buy a multiple comparison artifact here. I mean, there just appeared to be no effect whatsoever. Okay, so let me conclude with a few thoughts here. We've been in this really unusual era of aggressive federal activism. Now remember, we have this highly federalist system, nearly 100,000 public schools sitting within 14,000 local school districts with strong state and local control. So the federal role in influencing school policies and institutional practices is necessarily sort of limited. Yet we've been in this era when the federal government, sort of a long arc really, going all the way back to the Great Society, has been becoming more and more prescriptive about what goes on in schools and classrooms, and which is kind of odd given their limited purchase on all of that. But despite that, we see, you know, the federal policy has, to my mind, demonstrated a non-trivial capacity to catalyze reductions in the inequality of student outcomes. However, these policies only appear to be effective in some states and districts. And I guess one of the things I'm struggling with now is why. Right? You could argue that there's some element of historical accident based on personalities, and this isn't necessarily about what goes on in the classroom or even the school. It's about how these policies get mediated and moderated at the district level and in state education agencies as they're articulating how they're responding to the federal policies. Is there some historical accident there, or are there traits of states and districts that systematically influence the efficacy of these federal policies that are coming from Washington? Okay, and I don't have an answer to that. That might be a generative question for our discussion, and it's one I'm sort of looking into by dipping into political science and public administration literature, among other things. Okay, and finally, looking ahead to ESSA. Now, maybe the regs have changed around this in the time I've done this slide, but my understanding of where ESSA is now is going to have mandate continued testing, grades 3 through 8 and in high school. Critically, it's going to continue to have required subgroup reporting, which I think is important, and many national civil rights groups sort of fought hard for. But states are also going to have autonomy to define more flexible accountability systems that include non-test standards, and they're simply required to have challenging academic standards that may be the Common Core, but don't have to be. Now, the interesting thing is what we saw under waivers in terms of focused school improvement, whole school reforms, is going to continue. It mandates identification and intervention in those lowest 15% under the priority and focus school reforms. So what we're learning from waivers may have good predictive validity for what's going to happen going downstream. Now, the other thing I worry about is what about these other 85% of schools, many of which are serving disadvantaged students, students of color, et cetera. You know, there's an earlier literature from the pre-NCLB era that suggests just creating data and reporting it, so-called report accountability instead of consequential accountability, isn't really that effective. And so I sort of worry that there might be some fallback in school performance, particularly for racial and ethnic minorities in those schools as they move towards this system of just sort of pushing data out. But I think, you know, one of the broad messages I have around federal policy, again, they're both promise and limitations, and I think we need a research agenda that focuses more and more at the state and local level and pays renewed attention to sort of what are the factors that drive a really high fidelity and really effective implementation of these policies. Okay, thank you.